hopefully you found the handout on the Board of Accounts site, and for those who wanted to print it out, I've printed that out. I'm not going to go through every one of these slides and read in a lot of detail. Most of this, if not all of it, has been presented before. But at the Treasurers Conference, Brenda was giving the December settlement presentation, and I was sitting at the table, and some question about excise came up, and Brenda turned to me and asked me, and it just exploded from there. Suddenly we were talking about excise, and we were getting a lot of good discussion about excise, and there was a lot of give and take from the treasurers and our office and the Board of Accounts and with excise, and we came away from there thinking that, you know, while we've talked about this quite a bit, we really need to talk about it just a little bit more. There are a few things that we really need to drive home, and I want to mention those now, and then we'll look at the slides that pertain to that in particular. But first of all, from the treasurer's side, the treasurer absolutely needs to be and must be recording the excise on their cash book and on their cash book using the Bureau of Motor Vehicles deposit reports. We have many treasurers, or I don't know if term many is appropriate, but there are enough treasurers who are using the bank statement and bank deposits information from the bank to post the excise to their cash book, and their stance is that we don't want to put anything on our cash book that's not in the bank. Well, we don't want them to do that either. But by using the bank statement and the bank deposits proves nothing. I mean, it just proves that you put on your records what's in the bank. It doesn't prove that the reporting to the county by the Bureau of Motor Vehicles is correct, and it doesn't prove that that reporting and those deposits that they state that they're making are what they put in the bank. You don't discover any discrepancies if you just use that. While we don't want there to be discrepancies, you certainly aren't going to find any discrepancies. And I believe that some of the differences between auditor and treasurer records are stemming from the fact that the deposits to the banks aren't necessarily what the Bureau reported that they deposited, and that they deposited something different. Now, with you at auditor's office, you're checking the You're checking the deposit information from the Bureau to the transaction information from the Bureau, and you're finding that agrees, or if it doesn't agree, and when it doesn't, that you're contacting the Bureau and resolving that, and you're taking care of that. But unless the treasurer is using the deposit report to record that to their cash book and then verifying that as a bank statement reconciliation, you're not discovering whether or not that agrees. And I think some of that is what is attributing to the fact that the auditor and treasurer have different balances. And so we're driving that point home to the treasurers. I know you say, oh, you're talking to auditors, Dan. You know, you lost your mind. Well, I just want you to know what will be said to treasurers in upcoming conferences and presentations. And believe me, we're getting a lot of pushback from treasurers on that, but we're trying to, we're being just as stubborn in presenting that. So, having said all that, what does that mean? Well, that means the treasurer has to have access to the deposit report. Somehow or another, if you in your county, if your treasurer isn't being able to or doesn't go on the FTP site and get those deposit reports and use those as their posting documentation, if they're not doing that, then that gap needs to be closed. Either by having the treasurer have access to the FTP site and go out and get those reports on their own and use those reports for their posting documentation, or if that doesn't work in your county, then you, who I'm presuming everyone as in an auditor, all the auditors at some point in that time have to be getting on the FTP site. If that doesn't work for the treasurer to have direct access, that's our preferred. But if that doesn't work, then you need to be printing off those reports or attaching them to an email and sending them to the treasurer so that the treasurer has the deposit report. Now, that's the only report the treasurer needs. That's the only one that's has any meaning to them, has any information that they need. The vehicle registration reports, they don't need that. But you do, and you know that you use the registration reports for your posting to the excise ledger. Now, one more thing on the deposit report and the posting by the treasurer, the deposit date is the posting date for the treasurer. You, with the vehicle registration reports, the transaction date is what's important to you and is your posting date or your reference date in your excise ledger, because that's your date. But the deposit date is the important date for the treasurer. The thing that you should be doing, and as far as verification, you should be verifying that the totals on the transaction report, the transaction total is agreeing with the deposit report total. And that's a verification that you should be making. With the treasurer, when the treasurer finds differences when they do the bank reconciliation and the differences between the deposit report information and the bank statement deposits, they must contact Tamitha Cooper at BMV to resolve those, and then based on whatever the resolution is, then that will determine how they're going to handle it in their records. When you find differences between the registration reports and the deposit totals, you would contact Tamitha Cooper and determine what needs to be taken care of or corrected. And then both of you, whenever you find differences and you've worked out what's correct and what's going to be done to correct whatever might be wrong, you should communicate it between the auditor and treasurer, just to make sure you're communicating what you're finding. Then on a monthly basis, you should be doing a treasurer auditor reconciliation of the excise using what you have on the ledger posted and what the treasurer has on their ledger, and keeping in mind, there's going to be a difference because the treasurer's date is the deposit date, yours is the transaction date, and so, but those differences, as long as you do it on a monthly basis, you should be able to determine the differences and determine that those are legitimate differences, because there will and should be differences between the two. So that's really what we want to drive home is that using the BMV information for your recording and verifying the deposits and making sure the money is following the transactions. So one item I want to mention in one slide here is the fact that whenever you're bringing the reports off the FTP site onto your network, You always copy do not move, do not move, do not move reports. Because if you move it off the BMV site onto your network, and if something happens and it gets destroyed, lost, whatever, on your network, it's over with. There is nowhere to go to recover because you've taken it off the FTP site. So you want to make sure that you only copy, don't move. This slide, question I've heard is trying to make sense out of those file names. This slide in the presentation describes how the file name is laid out. The file name is very structured, and it's you probably have already figured this out, but in case you've been wondering, of course, obviously the first two numbers is the county number. The third number is important. The 0 indicating that file is the text file with the registration information, which you would use with your software to allocate the excise. I would strongly suggest, if you're trying to do that manually, that you look into getting software to do that. But that's the file you use. The 1 indicates the registration report, which is the printed report, and which would be the report you would look at whenever you're looking to verify the total on the registration report to the deposit. 2 indicates it's the assessor copy registration report. That particular report really doesn't have a lot of value any longer. It does contain the registrations with the excise, surtax, and wheel tax for counties that have those taxes, but you don't need to divide up excise, surtax, and wheel tax into taxing districts, because you're distributing the total based on the formula that's in the statute, and there's no need to know the taxing district identification. I do want to say here, well, I won't. There's going to be a slide later. 3 is the deposit report. This is the report the treasurer needs. This is also the report, though, that you need to look at when you're verifying the deposit amount to the total on the vehicle registration report. But this report here, the number 3 type, is the deposit report that if the treasurer has access to the FTP site, this is the only report they would need to go out and grab and print out and to use for their supporting documentation for their posting to the ledger or to the cash book. Then the 4th through the 7th is the year. The 8th and 9th numbers indicate the month, and then the 10th and 11th the day. And then the 13th or 12th and 13th is always MV, and then the last 4 is the report number. And we'll get to use of the report number here in a moment. So I'm not going to read all these to you. You can read, or you wouldn't be where you're at if you couldn't read. So I'm going to skip over these, but this is hopefully good information that you can use as a resource later. So the BMV deposit report, that's the slide we want to be at. And if I put my specs on, I can tell you the slide number. 9, okay. So this is it's a single page report. Hopefully you're familiar with this report. It gives you the excise tax, wheel tax, surtax, and then the total. And so for the treasurer, the excise amount is the amount for the treasurer's receipt. The wheel and surtax are the amounts for the quietus. The wheel tax and excise surtax should be quietus directly to those funds. They should not be posted to the treasurer's other sources on the cash book. It should be quietus directly to a fund. To the excise wheel tax or surtax in the wheel tax fund. The total is the amount that should be the deposit to the treasurer's bank account, and that's the amount that the treasurer is going to post on their cash book as the deposit to the BMV account. bank account. Pretty much already have stated this slide, just more about the deposit report and how that ties to the excise tax receipt on that next slide. Here's the one I want to talk about with the, it's hard to get, I got to stand up here, so excuse me, I got to put my glasses on. So this is how the recommended method for the excise tax receipt that you could take back to your treasurer if this is not how it's being done now. But the so from the deposit report, the treasurer's going to prepare that excise receipt, and the receipt date will be the date that they've prepared the receipt. The receipt amount is going to be the excise tax that's on the BMV deposit report. And then on the excise tax line of the receipt, we're recommending, and you would want them to do this, to enter the transaction through date that is shown on the BMV deposit report. And if this receipt is for more than 1 day, then they would put the range. So this receipt, by that having that information on the receipt, you can tie it to the excise registration transaction date or dates. And then also on that excise tax line, they would enter the report number. And remember, the report number is the last 4 numbers of the file name. And they would put the report number there again. That would be good information for you. And there again, if the receipt is for more than 1 day, then they would put the range. And then they would give a copy of that receipt to you that you could use then to verify against those transaction reports, to verify that what was on that deposit report is what's on your transaction reports. Next slide on excise surtax and wheel tax quietus. At the same time the treasurer prepares the excise tax receipt, then the auditor needs to prepare the quietus for the excise surtax and wheel tax, and this quietus should have the same date as the receipt, and quietus that money into the excise surtax and wheel tax fund or funds, and the quietus amount is the amount that's on the deposit report or deposit reports. So for both the receipt and this quietus, preferably this is done daily. If it's not done daily, then weekly. And if it's done weekly, then on the receipt needs to state the range, the date range for the transaction reports and the report number. Whatever the timing is for the receipt and the quietus, they need to be done at the same time, because the treasurer is posting to the bank balance on their cash book the total of the deposit, which includes the excise surtax and wheel tax. And to not prepare these at the same timing, it would cause an out of balance on the treasurer's cash book. So these other slides go into some more about the postings, and then our distributions to the county, and then your recording of the data in the excise ledger, and the structure of the ledger, and so forth. And all of these things feel pretty darn sure is already how it's happening, so there's no need to really go over that. The one slide though here, slide 18, it is a little more detailed discussion about the excise tax ledger, and just giving some guidance on the posting, that how the posting month is going to vary by the type of the excise, and the fact that your reference date on the excise tax is going to be the transaction date and not the deposit date. So what you record on March 31 in your excise ledger as a March 31 amount is actually what the treasurer had posted and deposited in the cash book on April 14th, because we have the 14-day difference between the two. Then on to slide number 20. Then here is the just some more guidance on the excise tax ledger and the fact that one thing I want to point out is the bullet point where it talks about the basis of the amounts posted are the BMV deposits and the BMV motor vehicle registration data, and that you need to, the excise tax deposit, the treasurer's receipt, equals the total of the excise tax data for that date on the last page of those registration reports. And so that doing this daily will help your balancing better, but you can do it in a date range. But you need to make sure that the treasurer puts on the receipt the transaction date and the report number in order for you to be able to do your verifying of their receipt against your reports. And if those agree, then you should be in balance with the treasurer. Just another slide reminding that the reports never move, the reports always copy. And we'll skip on to 25. This is just a slide discussing the fact that you should be doing a monthly reconciliation with the treasurer on the excise tax. And if you've not been doing a monthly reconciliation, obviously the first one is going to be difficult, maybe. But once you've gotten through the first one, then the rest should be much easier, because if you have differences, you're only looking at a month period of time as opposed to looking at a 6-month period of time or something else. On this slide here, number 27, this slide, what I want to point out here and emphasize is on the excise tax cutoff dates. I don't know how many counties have changed to a end of September cutoff for December, but if you haven't, I would strongly recommend that you change to an end of September date, because as you've noticed, we've been late on the excise tax cut distribution out to you, only because that we're getting the data from the Bureau of Motor Vehicles later and later each month. Hopefully that won't be the case this month, and they'll get it to us next week. But there's probably something else they're working on at the Bureau right now that's that's kind of late. Our data has become less of a priority, but we're in contact with them quite frequently about it. But I would strongly suggest, if you haven't changed, to a September. And so if you change, it's just a matter of changing. It's just an internal decision that you make. One of the things that you're going to notice with the settlement forms this go around, on the treasurer auditor reconciliation form, that yes, it's still part of it, required. We've added a line where you're going to tell us what your cutoff date is. That's only for us to help evaluate that reconciliation and the differences. And so if you change to September, then to be consistent, then going forward, you would change to a March cutoff for the June settlement, and then followed by September. If your cutoff date has been October and you're just now changing to September, obviously you're going to have 5 months in this settlement as rather than 6 months, but that's going to happen at whatever point you'd make the change. But then going forward, just stay consistent. The rest of this you can read for yourselves. It has to do with that most popular document of all, our auditor and treasurer reconciliation, and also the very last line. If you don't know how to contact Tamitha Cooper, I'm sure, hopefully you do, but if you don't, here's her email and her phone number. We found her to be great to work with. She works hard. She does the best she can. I'm going to say a saying. There's a gentleman in the State House. I think I just love his saying. He's an older gentleman, and I'll ask him, "How are you doing today?" And I'm doing the best I can with what I got. And so, I've borrowed his saying, but she's doing the best she can with what she's got there too. We probably have no time, for questions, unless you have questions that have a question that's more important than lunch. But if you have a question and you can put it in the box, or you can contact us, and we'll do our best to answer.